Well, as we go back and look within our scriptures, we could look at a number of letters, such as Paul's letter to the Corinthians. We could look at Paul's letter to the Galatians and many other places, and we could realize that within a number of those congregations, they had struggles. And many of those struggles were because they had differences, either differences in thought, differences in practice. But for whatever reason, they had issues within the congregation. And Paul, in essence, came back to teach them that they needed to overcome those issues. We could look a little bit closer and look at congregations within the 1800s. And the people who were the bedrock or the foundation for those congregations, they have died off and then they were replaced. And many of those congregations continued to exist. The older died off, the younger came up. Many of them even having differences in ideas or how they thought things should be done, and yet many of those faithful congregations continued to survive. The same thing when we begin to look at congregations within the early and mid and even later 1900s. Many of those who were the bedrock or the foundations of those congregations have died off. The younger have come up. They have replaced those, and again, the same thing. Many of the ways that they were doing things have changed within the actual society at the time. And so how is it that those congregations continued to survive, or how did they overcome the obstacles? We'll spend a little bit of time talking about overcoming our differences. We touched on this once before, I think a year or two ago, and I think it's important we come back and look at it again. And I think if you look at the world around us, I don't really think anybody here would probably disagree that there are an awful lot of different ideas and concerns, and they vary really from person to person, they vary from congregation to congregation, and they even vary based off of locale or where cultural differences maybe vary from region to region. And so wherever you go, the people are going to have significant differences based on location, but also based on age and a number of other factors. Now, I think that is certainly seen when we begin to look at, for example, political ideologies, but the same thing is seen when you begin to look within families and you begin to look within congregations. And these differences have caused a number of issues, not only within the families, but also within congregations. And we begin to ask questions, maybe the same questions we've been asking for a long time. Why are we losing so many people of the younger generations to Christianity? And if you look at I use the word Christendom as a whole, encompassing all people who claim to be followers of Christ. If you look at the numbers are continuing to decline, and they're getting more rapid every year. Why? Why are they leaving? What are some of the possible reasons, and why are we seeing this? Well, when it happens, and it does happen, we oftentimes will begin to oversimplify or generalize the cause, and we'll use words like worldliness, error. We might blame the individuals themselves, and to be honest, oftentimes a number of those points are valid. But really that is an oversimplification of what may cause people to either disagree regarding the direction of a congregation, or to disagree with ideology or understanding of the Scriptures in and of themselves, or for those who are not Christians and have never become Christians, it's an oversimplification as to why they haven't even obeyed the gospel in the first place. So, here's the question that we start off with. What happens when people begin to complain about the current state of the congregation or the church in general? Sometimes the preacher's response, or even the response of the individuals, the members within the congregation themselves, is to become defensive. Sometimes it is to become unbalanced. And sometimes it's to blame things like worldliness and denominationalism, or whatever it is that we decide to blame. And what I mean is this, let me put it in simple terms. Let's say, for example, someone decides to leave this congregation, and the reasoning that they give is the congregation is not a very loving congregation. Now, I haven't heard that from anybody. I'm just throwing an example out there. Oftentimes when somebody makes a statement, something like that, or whatever it may be, our natural response is to become defensive. when maybe our natural response would actually, the correct response would be to step back and look within ourselves and say, maybe either we were unloving either to that person, or maybe we're unloving and we didn't realize it, and there's some reasons why and some things we could do. That's the correct response. But oftentimes what happens is we don't do that. We blanket statements like, well, they're just becoming extremely worldly, or they've been influenced by the world or temptation or sin. And don't get me wrong, a number of those things like worldliness and sin, they do come in and they cause issues within congregations. But oftentimes we have to come back and we have to look and ask ourselves, why is a congregation struggling as a whole in this area? Why is a family struggling as a whole in this area? Why are individuals struggling as a whole in this area? How do we reach those people? How do we reach the unbelieving? How do we reach the now unfaithful? Jude says this in Jude 1:22, and of some have compassion, making a difference. It's pretty easy to say it, isn't it? It might be hard to do it. What all is involved in having compassion and making a difference? And why is there the need for the discernment? Well, here's part of the reason. Every congregation is made up of multifaceted people at different physical and spiritual levels in life. And they all have different life experiences. So here's what I'm saying. We as a congregation are made up of people from small to older, very mature in the faith to very immature in the faith, growing up in different places with different backgrounds. And that's not any different than the first century church. And what we have to figure out how to do is to, as a congregation, take all of those people and take the best qualities out of everything as we merge them together to make the strongest congregation that's possible. That's what they were doing in the first century. And when they fell short, Paul would write letters like we find 1 Corinthians and Galatians. Listen to what the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews 5:13 and 14. For everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Not every one of us within this congregation or within the church as a whole develop at the same time, at the same rate. We have baby Christians and we have experienced Christians. And that's not only within this congregation, but that's within every congregation across the world. So that means that we need a wide variety of practical sermons on everything from temptations of sin, issues with family, issues within marriage, how to interact with the world. How do we deal with being a Christian in a public setting, for example, with our jobs? It means that we need to cover an awful lot of stuff. But we don't just need those topics. We actually need doctrinal sermons then that would cover what many of us would consider to be very basic things, like the correct way to worship. What exactly is unity of the church? How about fellowship within the church? Understanding the Godhead, understanding the Holy Spirit, understanding roles between men and women, and talking about other basic things like heaven and hell. And I list all of those topics to say this. Many of those topics to you may seem very, very oversimplified and easy to understand, and you wonder why we even speak on them. And other topics to you may seem very complicated and hard to understand. And here's the problem. Within the congregation, you'll have those who might even struggle with some of the simpler topics, and you'll have those who do not, and they're striving for much, much deeper understanding. And so when you begin to look at how we teach and what we talk about, and you look at our Bible studies and even our lessons, they're very varied. They're varied in depth, and they're varied in range and topic. And certainly why every one of us in here should rely upon the same inspired scriptures. There isn't some universal one-size yearly calendar plan, at least I've not found it on the old Google machine, that tells me what to speak on every week and how to arrange those lessons so that everybody gets an understanding from them. And so the sermons need to go from all the way from the babe to the most mature that we have in an in-depth, understandable method. And then we wonder why congregations sometimes struggle. They struggle because they're trying to find a way to merge the youngers with different thought processes, the more mature with a different thought process, bringing them all together as they get them all to understand the Scriptures and cause the congregations to continue on. Because remember, I hate to tell you guys this, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. So as we here in the congregation begin to die off, and I'm looking at the younger ones are going to step up. But they think a little different than us, and there's reasons for that. We think different than those 100 years ago and even 200 years ago. So how do we overcome all of this? Paul says this in Acts 20, verse 26 and 27, and he gives us the understanding of there needing to be balance. He says, "Wherefore I take you to record this day that I am pure from the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God." Do the younger people here think different than the older? Yes. Do those who came out of other religious groups think different than those who grew up in the church? Yes. How do we get all of us to understand the same things and to work as a cohesive congregation? Well, Paul explains it, and I think we overlook it. It's very basic. He says he declared unto them the entirety of the counsel of God. And you may say that's an oversimplification of how to bring unity in the church and how to bring the divide between the young and the old. I don't think it is. I think a focus on just the counsel of God will do exactly what it's supposed to do. It will put all of us, whether young or old, whatever our background is, in the same mindset with the same understanding of what it is God expects for His followers. And again, we're a very diversified group here, not only in background, but also in age. And so when God gave us the inspired word, and what Paul was saying that he had preached the entire counsel of God, what Paul was showing us was he didn't just spend time on the stuff he liked and avoided the stuff he didn't like. He gave it all. The congregation needed all of it. Accounts of people being converted in the book of Acts actually began where those people were, where the hearer was, what it is they needed to hear at the time. And Paul does an excellent job in changing his approach towards people based on who they were, where they were from, and their background. And Paul dealt with Jews very different than he dealt with Gentiles. Maybe that's needed in the church when we look at lessons or study, and we have to begin to ask ourselves, how do we approach the younger people as opposed to the more mature people? Or those who were raised outside the church as opposed to those raised inside the church. Part of our understanding is this: truth doesn't change based on the culture around us, and it doesn't change based on people's opinions or current trends, nor is it the opportunity or the willingness to present lukewarm lessons that don't offend anybody in hopes that you can get everybody to come to the building. Paul certainly didn't do that, and we can't do that either. But we have to realize everybody's different. Everybody has different needs, and we have to start in many cases where that person is. And I mentioned this morning that there was a person that I knew, and I gave a little more information, but I don't want to say it here because it's on YouTube. But this person has gotten to the point where they are about to lose a loved one in their life, and it's the first time they've opened up a Bible. For us to reach a person, sometimes we have to reach them right where they are, right then and there. For me to sit down with that person and say, the very first time I talked to them about the Bible, to sit down and say, hey, has anybody really talked to you about the gospel plan of salvation? That's probably not the best spot to start. That's not where they're at. They're struggling with a life issue and death. Maybe I should start with the concept of death. Why is there death? And begin to work into the gospel and the need of a Savior. So we have to look at where people are, and we have to do that not only for those who are not yet Christians, but we have to do it for those within the congregation. Listen to Romans 15, verses 1 through 3. Paul says, "We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, and not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproached thee fell on me." As Christians, both educated, uneducated, both mature, both immature, you would hope that the purpose, no matter where we are in life, is to look at somebody else's needs and their best interests. And I think that used to be expected years ago. And as I look at the culture around us today, it doesn't seem to be such. It seems many people today are only focused on self. That's all they really think about. I don't know if you guys listen to country music. There's a song by Luke Bryan. The title of the song is "Most People Are Good." It's an interesting song. In general, I believe that both the young and the old normally have the well-being of others as a primary focus. It seems in my secular work setting, whether they're younger or older, and even if their ideologies are vastly extreme compared to mine, it seems that for many of those people, and I work with varied backgrounds, they normally are focused on other people's well-being. That's usually the case. Well, certainly that should be the case within the church. And if we're looking for other people's well-being, and I'm not saying we overlook sin, but if we're looking for someone's well-being, that's going to drive us to, one, want to deal with those who are in sin. It's going to drive us to want to deal with those who have not yet obeyed the gospel. But it should also drive us as a congregation to try to better ourselves and to narrow the divide between the younger and the older and the distance between those who are raised in the church as opposed to those who are out. And I say that because every one of our mindsets are vastly different. And I pointed it out this morning when I mentioned Jerry's background, and I said for many who've come outside the church, they're very, very focused on things like doctrinal matters. And yet for many in the church, they're not focused on so much the doctrinal side, they're focused more on the spirituality side of things like outreach, love, more on the emotion-based, right? And so we have to think about the differences within the church. Going back to the young and the old, put yourselves in your shoes, if you will, again, when you were 17 years old. What did you think about your parents? Do you think they're out of touch, out of reality? I'm sure my kids think that now. For the young people here, we have to remember that those who are older in the faith, it's not that they're out of touch with reality. They have a different mindset. They've dealt with different things. They've gone through a number of the things that you've not yet gone through. And they've made the mistakes that you're either going to make or that you're thinking about making right now. And yet many of the younger people will look at the older people and they look at them as being out of touch with reality. And now the flip side of the coin, and this is where I come in, many of us who now are a little bit older, we begin to look at the younger people. And we think they're wrong just because they're young. And yet I can think of a number of younger people who have spirituality, who have doctrine on their minds. And I can't look at them and say just because they think different or because they're young and they have a different mindset that their methods or ideas are wrong as it pertains to the church. Now, I'm not talking about somebody trying to change doctrinal matters. I'm just talking about their mindsets. But there's a big difference between how the young think and how the older think. And we're both guilty of oftentimes looking at those and thinking that their ideology or their method of thinking is wrong. And we also do it with sometimes those who were raised in the church as opposed to those who were not. And again, different mindsets. So we have to think about all that. So what's the greatest concern then for local congregations and families and then individual Christians? Well, here, let's break it down to this level. God's people have always had opponents. Sometimes our opponents come from within the congregation itself. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're from the world around us. But for each of us to stand for truth means we have to stand against those who oppose it. That means that we have to stand against sin. We have to stand against error. And I think oftentimes we get this understanding. And we certainly get it as we look throughout both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Listen to Psalms 97:10. Ye that love the Lord hate evil. He preserveth the souls of his saints. He delivereth them out of the hand of the wicked. Psalms 119, 104 says this, through my precepts I get understanding, and therefore I hate every false way. Paul wrote this to the Ephesians in Ephesians 6, 11, and 12. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. As Christians, because we vary in age, we vary in background, we oftentimes have different ideas of what is the biggest concern. Concern for the congregations, concerns for ourselves, for our families. And both age and life situations oftentimes determine what we would say is the biggest problem. Let me mention a few of those. Now, I'm going to start off with a general group. What is one of the biggest dangers for all? This is a danger for mature Christians. This is a danger for new Christians or immature Christians, those new in the faith. And it's even a danger for those who are unbelievers. And it all boils down to this. What is probably one of the biggest dangers? Denominational, doctrinal, religious error. However you want to summarize that. That is the biggest concern as I look at it. You may say, why? That is the number one reason for all unfaithfulness, unbelief, or someone's unwillingness to obey the gospel. It is based on doctrinal error of some kind. Why was Paul writing to congregations to try to get them to overcome their differences? There was doctrinal division, okay? Why do congregations split up? It's doctrinal division. Why do congregations oftentimes die out or split? Again, it's doctrinal error, it's doctrinal division. And so for many, that's their greatest concerns. And as I mentioned this morning, oftentimes you'll find those in the congregation who came from outside the church, from a different religious group of some sort, and to them, that is their key focus. They look at doctrinal division, doctrinal error, as the very biggest thing they're worried about. They've seen how destructive it is and how deceiving it is, and for those people, that is their greatest concern. I would probably fall into some of that category, okay? And as far as it being one of my largest concerns. Why? I have seen the destructiveness firsthand from many different religious groups, and I've seen what it has done to congregations as it's come in. This is not a new problem. It began in the first century. Paul had to deal with it in his letters. We saw it through the Reformation. We saw it in the Middle Ages. We've seen it through the Great Awakening. We have seen where there have been Christians battling against doctrinal error of some kind. And we all know congregations have ceased due to doctrinal error. We all know congregations have diminished in number due to doctrinal error. So for many, this is the largest danger they can think of. And I think that is oftentimes a valid concern. But does that mean there aren't other valid concerns? No, that's just for those people who are in that mindset. I think for many in the world today, defending doctrine has really taken second place. Many do not see the need for it. That's because, for the most part, we live in a culture where everybody believes they're okay, and all religious ideologies they look at as just being different roads to the same place. And that has made the need for defending doctrine a non-necessity. And so, that's what we find around us. In years past, that's not what we found. If you guys go down to my office, you'll find books from every religious group pretty much. And in years past, they all debated and talked about doctrine. And that's because all of those groups at that time looked at doctrine as being a vital concern, okay? So part of what I'm saying is there are always going to be those, and there should be, within a congregation who their primary concern is doctrine, doctrine, doctrine. And that is where their mindset is. And that's not necessarily wrong. I'm not suggesting there's not other things needed, but that's where their mindset is. That's their focus, okay? And you will find many of those in years past, guys, we look at those men who were considered great debaters. They may not be remembered for their amount of love in the church. They're remembered for their ability to defend the faith. I'm not saying they were unloving. I'm just saying that's what their mindset was, to defend the faith. You've got others within the church who are remembered for their love, their acts of charity, the way that they grew the church because of their focus on love and outreach. All of these differences are needed within the church, but for many, the biggest danger really is doctrinal error. We have to correct understanding of doctrine when there's misunderstanding. So listen to 2 John verses 1, 9 through 11. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. And if there come any unto you and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed, for he that biddeth him Godspeed is a partaker of his evil deeds. Now I have to say this, I'm focusing on those who are really standing fast for the faith. And I kind of have to separate in the world's terms between doctrine and the ideas of feelings and love and so forth. I don't look at defending the faith as unloving. If we love someone and they're lost, defending the faith and teaching them correctly is actually it's a manner of love. The church I think gets that. The world around us does not. You have some that you're focused on doctrine. We're focused on the love and the unity within the church and reaching to the lost around us. I think they're one and the same. I think the world around us doesn't look at it like that. But for many within the church, their primary concern is focused on doctrine. And this has varied over the years. We touched on it this morning, so I'll use that example. For many years, there was a battle between congregations and debates talking about, as they would call, institutionalism or anti-ism. I don't like using those terms. And that was constant back all the way from the 50s through the 70s. They were in a constant state of debate over those terms and what churches could do, what churches could not do. They both spent a lot of time on it. There's many books been written about it. And I'm not suggesting that topic is not important. What I'm saying is there was a time when you had those that were very focused on doctrine. And they wrote books about it and debated about it. And it was the topic of the day. For me, and it should have been. For many, this is not a concern. And regarding that topic in general, and we touched on it this morning, that entire topic's been so watered down. It's halfway between institutionalism, denominationalism, what other isms you can throw in there, what I would call progressivism. And many congregations and individuals rarely discuss any of those things anymore. And again, as I mentioned this morning, it's gotten to the point where churches of Christ, many of them really look at simply a name above a door and they go, based on the name, the place must be okay, right? We do the right acts of worship and we teach the correct plan of salvation, therefore we're a faithful, sound congregation. That's not necessarily true. For those that are focused on doctrine, they would know that. Let me put it this way real quick. How many of you guys ever get on Facebook and you'll see somebody on Sunday morning saying, hey, I need to go worship this morning. Does anybody know a local congregation in the area? Do you guys ever see those posts? Should you be looking for a congregation the morning of worship on Sunday? Not in this environment, no. You better start out a whole lot earlier than that. Otherwise, you may find yourself at a congregation that has the right name, and they may be a very loving group of people. They're not focused on doctrine, and they're therefore not following it. All of these issues need to be addressed, all doctrinal issues. 2 Timothy 1:13, hold fast the form of sound words which thou hast heard of me in faith and love, which is in Christ Jesus. You notice right there in that passage, Paul has everything from doctrine to faith and love. Remember I just said earlier, I think they all go together. The world today separates them, right? Well, he's focused on doctrine. I'm focused more on the faith and love part. Paul puts them all together, right? Another concern for many within the congregation is not so much doctrine, it's worldliness. Doctrine is certainly needed. Do you guys think we should be concerned about worldliness coming into our families, individual lives, and the congregation? Well, yes, certainly we should, right? The love of the world and many of the immoral aspects of the common culture around us is extremely evident in people's changing attitudes towards what was once clearly sinful. There's an awful lot of things that take place around us, guys, and we see it every day, and we know that it is wrong, but it's become so commonplace that the world around us doesn't think twice about it, and if we're going to be honest, there's even those within the church who do not think twice about it. And the reason is because they are so surrounded by this, they've become calloused to the point where they not only entertain themselves with worldliness, they're so surrounded and engulfed with worldliness, they don't even see it when it enters into their own life or the life of their family members or within the life of the congregation. Do we need people who are worried about doctrine? Yes. Do we need people within the congregation worried about worldliness? Yes. We have seen it destroy congregations. For many, the issue is dismissed. They'll say things like, that's just the society we live in. That's the world we live in. That's the culture we live in, and we can't get away from that, right? But here's the problem. When we begin to think like that, we begin to look like them, the world. We begin to talk like the world. We begin to act like the world. We begin to maybe engage in the things of the world. When people come to the congregation here, we want them to look at us as being totally different than the world. Totally different in the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we worship. Everything needs to be different, okay? And so it's still important for us to preach on things like worldliness. Listen to 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Most of you know this passage. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Here's what's interesting. I started off talking about the need for doctrine, and many in the congregation are focused on doctrine. For those that are in the congregation who would say they're not focused on doctrine, but they're focused more on worldliness and it coming into the church, did you guys know you can't know what worldliness is unless you know what doctrine is? So you can't separate doctrine from worldliness. There are a number of other factors. Let me touch on some other ones. For non-Christians, doctrine is not a concern. It should be. And sin is not a concern, and that's because they don't know doctrine. For many of us within the church, our concern is doctrine. Our concern is things like worldliness. Our concern is things like the manner in which the church should operate, the things they support, the things they do, right? There's a lot there. For some within the congregation, this is not their mindset, not first and foremost. Their mindset is more, they're more concerned with the hows and the whys of doing things as they are to maybe as opposed to doctrinal correctness. They're more concerned with the emotional aspect idea of church. Things like love, outreach to people, things like their own personal sense of spirituality in their life, their prayer life, and things like that. And let me say this, those are all good and those are all needed. There are many who are focused on doctrine who, if you were to talk to them, you would find out they have abysmal prayer life. They are not active in prayer. They're not active in outreach. They're not active in a number of things. And so you might look at them and say, he's a stout defender of the faith, and then you find out he rarely prays. He rarely does any type of work for those around him or helps the non-Christians around them as he tries to draw them to Christ. My whole point is you can be focused on the right thing, but not all the right things. Does that make sense? So you could have some in the congregation who are focused on one area and another group's focused on another area, and both of those things are needed, but they're not working in unison. And they wonder why within the congregation we have issues. why we can't all get on the same track. Many of the younger generations, again, are worried about things like that, and those things are needed. But those things, apart from the doctrine, lead to religious division. Oftentimes, immature Christians, or those who maybe have even left other religious groups, they have a hard time seeing these other religious groups as dangerous. They have a hard time looking at their erring family members as dangerous. They have a hard time looking at their erring brethren as dangerous or as enemies, because they oftentimes will include family members and friends. And these people, as far as the world is concerned, are good people, and they're interested in spiritual things. I'm not going to mention the person's name, but yesterday I got on Facebook, and a former person who used to attend here, from their Facebook page, I don't think they attend worship anymore at all. I could be mistaken. You probably can't find this person because you've all been blocked. Without giving too much information, this person's spouse is an atheist. That might help you out a little bit. You don't think for a second that those who surround themselves or are surrounded by those who are either unfaithful Christians or non-Christians, you don't think that's going to impact you? Without saying that person, you guys probably know who I'm talking about. Think back to that person 8 years ago. Were they here every time the doors were open, if you know who I'm talking about? The one whose husband was an atheist that sat back here. They were here all the time on Sunday. They were here on Wednesday. Was that person oftentimes focused on love and talking with other people? I'm thinking about the person. It seemed like they were always interactive with people. How do we get to where we're no longer worried about going to church at all or doctrine within the church? How do we not look at those outside the church as potentially being dangerous? Well, let me put it in a nutshell. Many of the people that we know who either do not go to church, who are not Christians, who are atheists, who are agnostics, or whatever label you want to put on it. They're people that we work with that we like. They're friends that we know that we've liked. They're family members that we know that we liked. And we have a hard time looking at people like that as being dangerous. It doesn't take very long before we begin to forget that we're not to be yoked to unbelievers, and we're not to associate ourselves to the world to the point where we don't realize we've been influenced. And again, I'm saying, as we look at congregations, the problems within congregations, they vary from person to person, whether young, whether old, and based on background. And so there are people within congregations, all from different viewpoints, dealing with different things, right? And they have different ways that they look at the problems within the church or how to do things. Should the church be focused on doctrine? Absolutely. Should we be concerned about worldliness? Absolutely. Should we be concerned about love and outreach? Absolutely. Oftentimes, what we find within congregations, though, is, and we're probably all guilty of it, we have our own areas that we focus on, and if we can't, as a congregation, begin to take each of those areas and they're all needed, and put them all together, we're going to fall short. Jesus gives us the idea that you can do some of it right and still get some of it wrong. Listen to Matthew 23:23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. What was Jesus saying? They're all necessary. You're just focused on this one area. Here's what I'm saying oftentimes within the church. You've got some who are just focused on doctrine, for example, but they're not focused on love and outreach. Are they falling short? Yep. And sometimes within a congregation you have those who are just focused on the love and the outreach, but they're not focused on doctrine. Are they falling short? Yes. Has every congregation dealt with this? Yes. Paul had to write letters to the Corinthians, to the Galatians. We see that this has always happened. Is it a concern for our congregation? Yes. Because of our differences in age from young to old, because of our differences in background from culture to culture, these are all concerns, okay? Let me list another problem that's impacted many congregations, and that is emphasis on matters of expedience. What I'm talking about is matters of choice on non-doctrinal issues. And it's caused issues within congregations, right? Brethren will throw fits over everything from, and somebody actually said it the other day, they'll throw fits on everything from carpet color to traditions of how we've done things within this building since the 20s or 30s or whatever it is. And they will argue and complain about things that have no basis on doctrine, and they'll hold some of those things up to really even being equal to the gospel itself. Like many of the Jews would hold up their practices as being equal to the Scriptures, when in reality it was just matters of opinion, matters of choice. And then we wonder why we have younger people within the church, and they see the bickering going on over things that don't even matter. And then they come back and they begin to look at us and they wonder how it is that we could treat each other with such lack of love and argue over things that mean nothing, and we literally squash what zeal they have in the promotion of the gospel and the church reaching out. And what I'm saying is this. People know a hypocrite when they see a hypocrite. People know when something is not illogical when they see what's illogical. What is more illogical than a group of believers that come together and say they love one another and they love God and they want to carry out the will of God, and then for those people, whether young or whether they're new Christians, to look at Christians bickering and fighting over things like carpet color, what time we meet, whether or not we have a PowerPoint presentation up here, right? And the list would go on and on. So how do you overcome all this? And it's not new. Paul was writing letters to the Corinthians and Galatians and so forth. Both old, both young, no matter where you came from, no matter your background, we need to be concerned about spiritual dangers. Is the need for doctrine a spiritual danger? Yeah. Is the concern about worldliness a spiritual danger? Yes. Is the concern about bickering over things that don't mean anything a danger? Yes. Is there a concern about not being loving to those around us or doing outreach enough to draw in the unbeliever? Is that a danger? Yes. Every bit of that is a danger. Every enemy of Christ has the potential to weaken or divert souls, and it has to be addressed. And let me point this out. Jesus actually rebuked the Sadducees in Matthew 22, verses 22 through 29. He also did the same thing to the Pharisees over in Matthew 23, 1 through 7. And my point is this. Jesus rebuked all the way from the conservative to the liberal people of his day. Do we have both liberal and conservatives within congregations? We do. And when I use that word conservative, I'm not using the word doctrine, okay? I'm using it in the way the world uses it. Just because somebody is conservative or just because someone is liberal doesn't mean that they may not have a valid point in how we as a congregation should operate. I'm not talking about changing doctrine here. I'm saying, let me give you an example. The way in which we do outreach here in the building, okay? Let's use that example. I could take someone who is very, very young and a person who is very, very old. And we can sit down and say, how do we reach the masses around us? Who do you guys think may have a better approach to reaching the people around us? Well, it's going to depend. Maybe the young people have a better ideology regarding technology. But that doesn't mean that theirs is the best method. Maybe the older people within the congregation have a better understanding as to what places we do outreach. What I'm saying is it takes all of that as a congregation and all those ideas brought together to try to overcome the divide within congregations. That's what Paul was trying to get them to do. I guess what I'm trying to say is within every congregation from the beginning of time, you have had a variation from the mature in the faith to the immature in the faith. Those can work together to carry out the spread of the gospel. And the immature will learn as they do it, and so will the mature. And then you look at those that came from other religious groups outside the church and those maybe that grew up in the church. And again, they have different ideas on how they can do things or should do things. And again, sometimes their focuses are in different places. It doesn't invalidate the other focuses. What I'm saying is they're all needed. And if we'll look within ourselves, what we'll oftentimes find is we lean to one area and we need to actually do all of it, just as Jesus points out. You can do some of it right and still get it wrong. It takes every one of us within a congregation to carry out the work of the congregation. It takes all of that to take place for the younger to actually gain experience. And it goes back to what I started off with. The congregations in the 1800s are gone, guys. As the older died off, the younger people replaced them. But things changed from the 1800s until this year, 2024. And somehow the church has continued to grow through all the technological changes and all that taking place. How did they do that? Well, they had to overcome differences. Differences between people, difference between thought processes about how things should be carried out. The only thing that they could not change was this: what it is that the Scriptures mandate for us as followers of Christ. There's certain things that can never be changed. We can't change how it is that we are, to worship. We can't change how it is we're to love people. We can't change any of the doctrinal stuff. But there's a lot of stuff within the congregations that we have room for improvement. And those are the things that we need to be focused on, and we should be able to work together as a body to do that. And I guess that's really my concern as I draw this to a close. How is it that each of us, no matter where we are right now, how is it that we work together in one, edifying this body, keeping this body strong, while at the same time trying to reach out to those around us who are not yet Christians, or even to those who are now erring in the faith? That would be my concern. For those who are not yet Christians, if you want to become a Christian, if you're watching this online or if you're here, it's not complicated. How did people become Christians in the first century? Well, you had people going around like Paul and Peter, the other disciples, and they were teaching simply that Jesus came. He was the fulfillment of the prophecies found within the Old Testament. He came and lived a sinless life. He shed his blood for the establishment of the church. And then they talked about the need for faith. Hebrews 11:6, John 8:24. They talked about the need for repentance. Luke 13:3 and 5. Jesus makes it very clear you have to repent. It's not enough to just have faith. You've got to repent. And that's because there's a consequence for sin, and we've all sinned. Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23. And so these ministers were going about, and they were teaching about who Jesus was and why he came, and the church being established, the danger of sin and the need to repent. And these people were hearing this and accepting Jesus as their Messiah, and they were confessing him as Christ. Romans 10:9 and 10 would be an example. And then they were being immersed in water. Every conversion account ends that way. You can go back and look at Acts 2:38, where Peter tells them to repent and be baptized. You could look at Jesus as he commands it in Mark 16:15 and 16. You can see where it describes this immersion in water being a burial and a death and resurrection as we mimic Jesus' death and resurrection. Peter actually says that it doth also now save us. So certainly baptism was a requirement. And then after that, we simply see that they began to live as Christians with the goal of reaching out to those around them. And that mandates that they incorporate doctrine. They have to know how to worship correctly. But they also have to know how to treat those around them and the things that they must do in their personal life. And that's the hard part, is living as a Christian and really doing the work of the church, which is reaching the lost. That's what we're called to do. Live faithful after we've become a Christian to reach out to those around us. It takes all of us. Those that are stronger in this area help those who are not, and those who are stronger in this area help those who are not. All of that is needed within the body. And hopefully, as I've just mentioned a few of the things today, we can look within ourselves and say, you know what, I lean more this way, I need to work more on this. It's all needed. And I think if we're honest, we'll all, if we look back, see where our shortcomings are. As I draw this to a close, if there's a way that we can assist you in any way, you can come forward as we're led in a song of invitation.